The winter of 1942 hung over the Eastern Front like a shroud, and along the banks of the Volkhov River the Soviet offensive had ground to a bloody stalemate. Colonel Mikhail Petrov stood in the frozen command post, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, studying the map before him with eyes that had grown accustomed to reading death in contour lines and grid coordinates. The morning of January 12th had begun like any other morning in that terrible winter, with the promise of nothing but more suffering, more sacrifice, more futile advances against German positions that seemed carved from iron and will. He had no way of knowing that within hours he would witness something that would change the nature of armored warfare forever, something that would enter the nightmares of Soviet tank commanders for years to come. The radio crackled to life with a voice tight with urgency, and Petrov recognized the call sign of Captain Ivanov, commanding a company of T-34 tanks probing German defenses near the village of MGA. The transmission was professional at first, reporting contact with enemy armor, nothing unusual in the grinding attritional warfare that had consumed this front for months. But then Ivanov's voice changed, acquiring an edge that Petrov had never heard before, not in all the desperate battles they had fought together. "Something is wrong," Ivanov said, and those three words carried more weight than any tactical report.
"Our shells are bouncing off. They're just bouncing off."
Petrov leaned closer to the radio, his pulse quickening despite himself. He had heard men lie in battle, had heard them exaggerate, had heard them break under pressure. But this was different. This was a competent officer, a veteran of a dozen engagements, reporting something that should have been impossible. The engagement unfolded in fragmentary reports over the next 20 minutes, each transmission more desperate than the last. Ivanov's company had encountered what he initially believed to be a small group of German Panzer IVs, the workhorse of the Wehrmacht's armored forces, tanks the Soviets had learned to respect but also learned to kill. The T-34s had maneuvered into firing positions with the confidence born of experience, their commanders knowing that their sloped armor and powerful 76.2mm guns gave them better than even odds against most German armor. The first volley was fired at a range of 800 meters, a distance at which Soviet tankers had destroyed countless enemy vehicles. But the shells struck the lead German tank and ricocheted skyward in bright sparks, and in that moment everything the Soviet tankers thought they understood about armored combat began to unravel. "It's massive," Ivanov reported, his voice struggling to maintain military composure. "Taller than anything we've seen. The armor is thick, incredibly thick. We're firing again." Petrov could hear the distant thunder of tank guns through the radio, the sound of battle compressed into electronic noise. "No effect, no penetration. We're closing the range." There was a pause, filled with the static hiss of the transmission and the muffled sounds of combat. Then Ivanov spoke again, and this time his voice carried something that Soviet officers were trained never to show, something that could spread through an army like plague: fear. "They're firing back. Yegorov's tank just exploded. One shot. God in heaven, one shot, and it just came apart." Petrov grabbed his coat and was moving before the transmission ended, calling for his staff car, for motorcycle couriers, for anything that could get him forward to see this new threat with his own eyes. The drive through the frozen landscape felt interminable, passing columns of infantry huddled against the cold, artillery positions dug into the snow, all the machinery of modern war that suddenly seemed inadequate, obsolete, child's toys in the face of whatever was happening at the front. He arrived at a forward observation post just as Ivanov's company was falling back, and through his binoculars Petrov finally saw it, the Tiger tank, moving with ponderous majesty through the winter landscape like some great predatory beast that had wandered into the wrong century.
It was enormous in a way that photographs could never capture, its angular hull and massive turret creating a silhouette that seemed to violate everything Petrov understood about tank design. The German tanks he had fought before were lean, efficient machines built for speed and maneuver. This thing was different. This was a mobile fortress, a statement of industrial might and tactical philosophy that spoke of something beyond simple military engineering. It moved slowly, almost contemptuously, its 88mm gun traversing with mechanical precision to find targets. As Petrov watched, the Tiger fired, and a T-34 nearly 2 kilometers distant simply ceased to exist, replaced by a column of black smoke and scattered debris. The range was impossible. The accuracy was impossible. Everything about what he was seeing was impossible, and yet it was happening. Major General Dmitry Lelyushenko received the first reports of the new German tank that afternoon in his headquarters, and his initial reaction was skepticism bordering on anger. He had heard too many panicked reports from the front, too many sightings of wonder weapons that turned out to be nothing more than fear and exhaustion playing tricks on men's minds. But as the reports continued to arrive, each one corroborated by multiple witnesses, each one consistent in describing armor that Soviet guns could not penetrate and firepower that could destroy Soviet tanks at ranges previously thought impossible, Lelyushenko's skepticism began to give way to a cold dread. He had fought in the Great Patriotic War since the first hours of the German invasion, had seen his nation brought to the brink of annihilation, and had witnessed its slow, painful resurrection through blood and determination. He had believed that the worst was behind them, that Soviet industry and Soviet courage were finally gaining the upper hand. Now he was being told that the Germans had deployed a weapon that changed the calculus of armored warfare itself. The telephone call to Moscow was one of the most difficult conversations of Lelyushenko's career. How did one explain to the high command that years of tank development, millions of rubles invested in the T-34 program, the pride of Soviet engineering, had suddenly been rendered inadequate? The voice on the other end of the line was Colonel General Andrei Vlasov, and Lelyushenko chose his words carefully, knowing that bearers of bad news in Stalin's Soviet Union trod a dangerous path. Comrade General, we have encountered a new type of German heavy tank. Our standard anti-tank weapons appeared to be ineffective against it at normal combat ranges.
There was a long silence on the line, and when Vlasov spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man calculating political as well as military ramifications. Ineffective? You mean your men are not closing to proper range? You mean they are not showing proper aggressive spirit? Lelyushenko felt anger rise in his throat, but forced it down, forced his voice to remain steady. I mean, Comrade General, that our 76mm shells are bouncing off its armor like pebbles off a wall. I mean that it is destroying our tanks at ranges where we cannot effectively return fire. I mean that unless we develop new tactics and new weapons, we are going to lose a great many good men.
The interrogation reports of captured German tank crew members began to arrive at Soviet intelligence headquarters in the days following those first engagements, and they painted a picture that was simultaneously alarming and enlightening. The Tiger tank, officially designated Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausführung E, mounted an 88mm KWK-36 gun, a weapon that had already earned a fearsome reputation as an anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, angled only slightly, and its side armor was 80 millimeters. These were numbers that made Soviet tank designers physically pale when they saw them. The T-34, pride of Soviet armored forces, had frontal armor of 45 millimeters. The Tiger weighed 54 tons, nearly twice the weight of a T-34, and that weight was almost entirely devoted to armor and firepower. It was slow, consuming fuel at a prodigious rate, and mechanically complex in ways that would prove problematic for German logistics. But none of that mattered when it was pointed at you across a battlefield, when its gun was traversing toward your position, when you knew that your best efforts would likely accomplish nothing except to reveal your location before you died. Captain Boris Shumilin had commanded T-34s since the defense of Moscow, and he considered himself a veteran tanker, skilled in the brutal calculus of armored combat. He had learned to read terrain, to use mobility as armor, to strike from the flank and from ambush. He had destroyed German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, had learned their weaknesses and exploited them without mercy. When his battalion was ordered forward to probe German positions near Leningrad in late January, he approached the mission with the confidence of experience. His confidence lasted exactly as long as it took for the Tiger to fire its first shot. Shumilin's tank was in a tree line, hull down in a carefully chosen position that offered both cover and a clear field of fire. He saw the Tiger emerge from the village ahead, moving with that distinctive slow deliberation that he would come to associate with the vehicle. His gunner ranged the target at 900 meters, a distance at which the T-34's gun could be effective against thinner armor. "Load armor-piercing," Shumilin ordered, his voice calm and professional. "Target the heavy tank. Fire when ready." The gun bucked, the breech recoiled, and through his periscope, Shumilin watched the shell strike the Tiger's frontal armor. There was a bright spark, a momentary flash, and then the shell was gone, deflected into the sky. The Tiger didn't even pause. Its turret began to traverse, moving with hydraulic smoothness, and Shumilin suddenly understood that he had made a terrible mistake. "Reverse!" he shouted. "Get us back! Now!" But before his driver could engage the transmission, the Tiger fired. The shell passed through the space where Shumilin's tank had been positioned, with the sound of tearing metal and displaced air. It missed by meters, a near miss that would haunt Shumilin's dreams for years, and struck a tree behind them that simply ceased to exist, transformed into splinters and smoke. Shumilin's tank lurched backward, crashing through underbrush, and he felt the animal terror of prey fleeing a predator. They retreated 500 meters before he felt safe enough to stop, and when he finally caught his breath, when his hands stopped shaking enough to hold his binoculars, he watched the Tiger continue its advance, unopposed and seemingly invulnerable. That night, sitting in a frozen dugout with the other company commanders, Shumilin tried to explain what he had experienced, tried to find words for the helplessness of facing an enemy that you could not hurt. "It's not just a tank," he said finally, his voice hollow. "It's a statement. It's the Germans telling us that they can build something we cannot kill."
The Soviet response to the Tiger evolved in stages, each one marked by hard lessons and bitter casualties. The first stage was denial, the belief that the reports were exaggerated, that proper tactics and aggressive action would prove sufficient. The stage lasted approximately 3 days and cost the Red Army dozens of tanks and hundreds of crew members. The second stage was panic, manifested in orders from higher headquarters demanding that local commanders destroy the Tigers immediately, as if will alone could penetrate 100 millimeters of hardened steel. The stage lasted a week and accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the gulf between political expectations and battlefield reality. The third stage was adaptation.
The slow, painful process of learning how to fight an enemy that enjoyed overwhelming technical superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Zinovy Kolobanov had earned a reputation as one of the Red Army's finest tank commanders during the defense of Leningrad. And in February of 1943, he was called to a meeting at front headquarters to discuss tactics for engaging the Tiger. The room was filled with tank officers, artillerymen, and infantry commanders, all of them wearing the same expression of grim determination mixed with barely concealed anxiety. The briefing officer was a young major from the Tank Directorate in Moscow, and he approached the podium with the nervous energy of a man who knew his audience had more battlefield experience than he would accumulate in a lifetime. "Comrades," he began, "we have analyzed the Tiger's capabilities and identified several vulnerabilities." The room stirred with interest. "First, the Tiger is slow. Its maximum road speed is approximately 38 kilometers per hour, and cross-country it moves even slower. Second, it is mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. Third, its armor, while thick, is invulnerable. At close range, at very close range, the 76-millimeter gun can penetrate the side armor." Kolobanov raised his hand, and the major nodded in his direction. "How close?" Kolobanov asked. "Define very close range." The major consulted his notes, and when he answered, his voice was apologetic. "Under 500 meters, ideally under 300. And you must hit the side or rear armor. The front is impenetrable to our current guns at any practical combat range." The room erupted in bitter laughter and angry muttering. 300 meters! In tank combat, 300 meters was knife-fighting range, a distance at which the Tiger's superior optics and faster rate of fire would give it an overwhelming advantage. To close to 300 meters meant accepting losses, meant sacrificing tanks to create opportunities, meant asking men to drive toward a gun that could kill them at 2 kilometers in the hope of getting close enough to strike back. It was a tactic born of desperation, and everyone in the room knew it, but it was also the only tactic they had. The industrial response to the Tiger came slowly, hampered by the chaos of wartime production and the technical challenges of rapidly developing new weapons. Soviet engineers worked the clock to design larger guns, to develop more powerful anti-tank rifles, to create specialized tank destroyers that could match the Tiger's firepower. But engineering takes time, and production takes longer. And in the interim, Soviet tank crews had to face the Tigers with the tools they possessed. The 76-millimeter gun of the T-34 could penetrate the Tiger's side armor at close range as promised, but getting to close range meant exposing yourself to fire from a gun that could destroy you at 2 or 3 times that distance. The calculus was brutal. For every Tiger destroyed, the Soviets could expect to lose multiple tanks. It was an exchange rate that would bankrupt any army except one that possessed the vast industrial capacity and seemingly limitless manpower of the Soviet Union. And so the exchange was made again and again in frozen fields and ruined villages across the Eastern Front.
Major Yakakov Jugashvili, son of Stalin himself, though few knew this and he never spoke of it, commanded a rifle regiment near Smolensk when he encountered his first Tiger in March of 1943. He was not a tanker, had no specialized training in anti-tank warfare, but war has a way of making everyone an expert in everything. And by that stage of the conflict, every Soviet officer understood that the Tiger represented a problem that extended beyond simple military tactics. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, a machine that broadcast German technical superiority and German confidence in ultimate victory. To let it rampage unchecked was to cede not just ground but morale, to allow the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement.
Djugashvili gathered his anti-tank gun crews and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "That tank can kill you from 2 kilometers away," he told them. "Your guns can hurt it only at a fraction of that range. This means you must let it get close. This means you must hold your fire until you can see the faces of the crew through the vision ports. This means that some of you will die. But if we do not stop it, it will kill far more of our comrades, and it will do so with impunity." The battle unfolded in the late afternoon, the Tiger advancing along a dirt road flanked by low hills where Djugashvili had positioned his guns. He had 4 76mm ZIS-3 field guns, weapons designed primarily for indirect fire support but capable in the anti-tank role if employed correctly. The key, he knew, was to hold fire, to resist the temptation to shoot at maximum range, to let the Tiger come within killing distance even as it systematically destroyed their positions. The Tiger appeared around a bend in the road, moving slowly, its commander clearly confident in its vehicle's superiority. At 1,500 meters, it fired at one of the gun positions that Djugashvili had deliberately left exposed, a decoy position manned by logs wrapped in canvas. The Tiger shell obliterated the fake gun, and the tank continued forward. At 1,000 meters, Djugashvili could feel his gun crews tensing, their fingers on triggers, their training screaming at them to shoot. "Hold," he said quietly into his radio. "Wait, wait." At 500 meters, the Tiger was close enough that he could see details, the way its tracks chewed the muddy road, the antenna whipping in the breeze, the commander's hatch opening as an officer scanned for threats with arrogant casualness. At 300 meters, Djugashvili gave the order. 4 guns fired nearly simultaneously, the shells converging on the Tiger's flank from multiple angles. 3 struck home. The first penetrated the side armor below the turret ring. The second struck the track and suspension, immobilizing the beast. And the third found a weak point near the engine compartment. The Tiger shuddered, smoke beginning to pour from its hull, and then the crew began to bail out, tumbling from hatches with their clothes on fire. It was a victory, but it was a victory that had required perfect positioning, perfect discipline, and perfect timing. And even then, Djugashvili knew they had been lucky. If the Tiger had been accompanied by infantry, if it had been more cautious, if the terrain had been different, his guns would now be scrap metal and his crews would be dead. The reports continued to flow back to Moscow throughout the spring of 1943, each one adding to the growing dossier on the Tiger tank and its impact on Soviet military operations. Colonel General Nikolai Voronov, chief of Soviet artillery, studied these reports with the intensity of a man who understood that the war was becoming a race between industrial capacity and tactical innovation. The Tiger represented a German philosophy of warfare that prioritized quality over quantity, individual superiority over massed production. It was the Teutonic ideal made manifest, fewer machines, but each one a masterpiece of engineering, each one capable of destroying multiple enemy vehicles before succumbing to weight of numbers. The Soviet approach was different, born of necessity and national character. The T-34 was a good tank, sometimes a great tank, but it was also a tank that could be produced in vast quantities, a tank that could be crewed by hastily trained conscripts, a tank that embraced simplicity over sophistication. The question that kept Voronov awake at night was simple. Could quantity overcome quality when the quality gap was this large?
The Battle of Kursk in July of 1943 would provide an answer to that question, but the answer would be written in blood and burning metal. In the largest tank battle in history,
Tigers spearheaded German assaults, smashing through Soviet defenses with terrifying efficiency. Soviet commanders who had studied the reports, who had trained their crews, who had prepared elaborate ambushes and fighting positions, found that theoretical knowledge and battlefield reality were very different things. Colonel Pavel Rotmistrov, commanding the 5th Guards Tank Army, watched his carefully hoarded tank reserves evaporate in the face of German armor, and among the German armor, the Tigers stood out like wolves among sheep. His after-action report, filed in the aftermath of the battle, was remarkable for its honesty. "The Tiger tank represents a qualitative leap in armored warfare," he wrote. "Our crews are brave, our tactics are sound, but we are asking men in medium tanks to fight heavy tanks in what amounts to single combat. We are asking T-34 commanders to close to suicide range to engage targets that can destroy them at leisure. We are winning through attrition, but the cost is unsustainable." Yet they did win, at Kursk and in the countless smaller battles that followed, because the Soviet Union possessed something the Germans did not: depth. Depth of manpower, depth of industrial production, depth of national will. For every Tiger that rumbled off a German production line, 50 T-34s rolled out of Soviet factories. The exchange rate was brutal, but mathematically it worked. A Tiger might destroy 5, 10, even 15 Soviet tanks before being disabled or destroyed. But the Soviet tanks kept coming, wave after wave, and behind them came the infantry, the artillery, the engineers, the entire weight of a nation fighting for its survival. The Tiger was a magnificent weapon, perhaps the finest tank of its generation, but it was also a weapon that required a kind of warfare the Germans could no longer sustain: careful, methodical, quality-focused combat where each engagement was a tactical masterpiece.
The Eastern Front in 1943 was not a place for masterpieces. It was a grinding, brutal, industrial slaughter where victory went not to the most skillful, but to the most numerous. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrenenko, who would become one of the highest-scoring Soviet tank aces of the war, encountered his first Tiger in the autumn of 1943, and his account of the engagement offers a window into how Soviet tactical thinking had evolved. By this point in the war, Soviet tankers had developed a healthy respect bordering on fear for the German heavy tanks, but they had also developed tactics for dealing with them. Lavrenenko's approach was to avoid frontal engagements entirely, to use the T-34's superior mobility to maneuver constantly, to force the Tiger to turn its turret, to keep it off balance and reactive. He hunted the Tiger like a pack predator, using multiple tanks to attack from different angles simultaneously, accepting that some of his tanks would likely be destroyed, but knowing that the Tiger could only shoot at one target at a time. It was a tactic that required courage and coordination, that accepted losses as inevitable, but it worked more often than not. The engagement took place in a burnt-out industrial area on the outskirts of Kiev, a landscape of rubble and twisted metal where sight lines were short and ambushes were everywhere. Lavrenenko had 3 T-34s under his command, and he positioned them carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire that would force the Tiger to expose its flanks no matter which direction it faced. When the Tiger appeared, moving cautiously through the ruins, Lavrenenko gave the signal. All 3 tanks fired at once, their shells converging on the Tiger from 3 directions. The Tiger's frontal armor deflected one shell, but another struck its side, and a third hit the rear. The Tiger's turret began to transverse, its guns seeking targets with mechanical efficiency, and it fired, destroying one of Lavrenenko's tanks instantly. But by then,
The remaining 2 T-34s had moved, circling like wolves, firing again. The Tiger's track was hit, and it slewed to one side, immobilized. Lavrenenko's gunner fired again, aiming for the engine compartment, and this time the shell penetrated and smoke began to pour from the Tiger's hull. The engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes and had cost Lavrenenko a third of his force, but the Tiger was dead, and Lavrenenko was alive to fight another day.
General Georgy Zhukov, perhaps the greatest Soviet commander of the war, wrote in his memoirs about the psychological impact of the Tiger tank on Soviet operations. It was not merely the machine itself that troubled us, he wrote, but what it represented. The Germans had been pushed back from Moscow, had failed to take Leningrad, had been destroyed at Stalingrad. We believed we had seized the initiative, that the worst was behind us. The appearance of the Tiger suggested that the Germans still possessed the industrial capacity and technical sophistication to innovate, to surprise us, to deploy weapons against which our standard responses were inadequate. It raised the question of what else they might have in development, what other surprises awaited us. The Tiger forced us to confront the uncomfortable reality that this war was far from over, that the Germans were still capable of mounting a serious challenge, and that victory would require even greater sacrifices than we had already made. The Soviet industrial response to the Tiger took the form of several new weapons, each designed to address specific aspects of the threat. The Su-152 self-propelled gun, mounting a massive 152mm howitzer, could destroy a Tiger with a single hit, though its low rate of fire and mediocre armor made it vulnerable in turn. The T-34-85, an upgraded version of the standard T-34 with a larger 85mm gun, could penetrate the Tiger's side armor at reasonable combat ranges, finally giving Soviet medium tanks a fighting chance. But these weapons took time to develop and deploy, and in the interim, Soviet tank crews had to make do with what they had, which meant closing to knife-fighting range and accepting horrific casualties. The commanders who sent men into these engagements carried the weight of those losses for the rest of their lives. They had made the cold calculation that trading 3 or 4 T-34s for one Tiger was strategically acceptable, but knowing something is strategically necessary does not make it any easier to order men to their deaths. Major General Mikhail Katukov, one of the most innovative Soviet armor commanders, developed what became known as the pack front defense, a tactic borrowed and adapted from German defensive doctrine. Rather than attempting to engage Tigers in mobile combat, where German superiority in optics, gun range, and armor protection gave them overwhelming advantages, Katukov positioned his tanks in prepared defensive positions, hull down, with extensive anti-tank gun support and pre-registered artillery. The Tigers, when they attacked, found themselves channeled into kill zones, where they could be engaged from multiple angles simultaneously, where their mobility advantage was negated, where Soviet numerical superiority could be brought to bear effectively. It was not a perfect solution. Tigers still inflicted heavy casualties even under these conditions, but it was a solution that worked more often than not, that transformed the Tiger from an unstoppable monster into a very dangerous but ultimately killable enemy. The winter of 1943-1944 saw the Soviet Union beginning to turn the tide, not just through tactics, but through industrial might. New weapons were arriving at the front in increasing numbers. The IS-2 heavy tank with its massive 122mm gun that could match the Tiger. The Su-100 tank destroyer with its powerful 100mm gun, improved anti-tank mines, and shaped charges that could disable even heavy armor. But the most important weapon was not any single piece of hardware, but rather the accumulated experience of millions of Soviet soldiers who had learned through hard trial how to fight the Wehrmacht and how to kill its tanks. The mystique of German technical superiority was fading. replaced by a hard-edged professionalism that understood the enemy's strengths and weaknesses and exploited the latter without mercy. Captain Ivan Yakubovsky, who would later rise to the rank of marshal, encountered his last Tiger in the spring of 1944 during operations in Belarus, and his account of the engagement reveals how much Soviet tactical thinking had evolved. By this point, encountering a Tiger was no longer a cause for panic, but rather a tactical problem to be solved with speed and precision. Yakubovsky commanded a company of T-34-85s, and when his scouts reported a Tiger blocking a key road junction, he responded with practiced efficiency. 2 tanks were sent on a flanking maneuver to the north, 2 more to the south, while his own tank and 1 other approached from the front, deliberately drawing the Tiger's attention. The Tiger, recognizing the frontal threat, oriented its massive gun toward Yakubovsky's position and fired, the shell passing so close that Yakubovsky felt the pressure wave. But by then, the flanking tanks had reached firing positions, and 4 shells struck the Tiger's sides nearly simultaneously. The Tiger shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches, and its commander bailed out with his hands raised. The entire engagement had taken less than 5 minutes, and Yakubovsky had not lost a single tank. As he surveyed the burning Tiger afterward, he felt not triumph, but rather a kind of tired satisfaction. The Germans' wonder weapon was still dangerous, still deadly, but it was no longer invincible. The accounts of Soviet commanders who first encountered the Tiger tank in battle form a narrative of adaptation under pressure, of learning to fight an enemy that enjoyed overwhelming technical advantages, of finding ways to win not through superior hardware, but through tactics, determination, and sheer bloody-mindedness. They speak of the terror of facing a weapon against which standard responses were useless, of the frustration of watching shells bounce harmlessly off armor that seemed impossibly thick, of the anger at losing men and machines to an enemy that could kill with impunity. But they also speak of adaptation, of developing new tactics and new weapons, of learning to turn numerical superiority into victory despite catastrophic loss rates. The Tiger tank changed armored warfare on the Eastern Front, forced the Red Army to innovate and adapt, and cost the Soviet Union thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of crew members. But in the end, it could not stop the tide of Soviet armor rolling westward towards Berlin.
The legacy of these first encounters with the Tiger would shape Soviet military thinking for decades. The experience of facing a technically superior enemy had burned itself into the institutional memory of the Red Army, creating a determination never again to find themselves at such a disadvantage. After the war, Soviet tank design would emphasize heavy armor and powerful guns, would prioritize protection and firepower, even at the cost of mobility and crew comfort. The T-44, the T-54, the entire lineage of Soviet heavy tanks that would dominate Cold War planning, all traced their ancestry back to those desperate winter battles when Soviet tankers first saw the Tiger and understood that they were facing something fundamentally new and fundamentally dangerous. The commanders who survived those encounters, who learned to fight the Tiger and learned to kill it, would rise through the ranks and would carry with them the lessons learned in blood on the frozen battlefields of 1943 and 1944. In the end, the Tiger tank was a magnificent weapon that arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. Germany produced approximately 1,350 Tigers during the entire war, while the Soviet Union produced over 60,000 T-34s. The mathematics of industrial warfare are brutal and simple. Quality can overcome quantity only up to a certain point, and beyond that point, quantity has a quality all its own. The Tiger represented the pinnacle of German armored design, a machine that embodied everything the Wehrmacht valued about warfare: technical superiority, tactical excellence, individual prowess. But the Eastern Front was not a place where such values could triumph. It was a meat grinder, an industrial slaughterhouse where victory went to the nation that could absorb losses and continue fighting, that could replace every destroyed tank with 2 more, that could lose 1 million men and draft another 1 million. The Soviet Union was that nation, and no amount of technical superiority could change that fundamental reality. The words of Soviet commanders who first encountered the Tiger in battle were words of shock and fear, but they were also words that revealed something essential about the nature of the Eastern Front and the nature of the war itself. They spoke of facing a weapon that seemed designed to break their will, that seemed to say that German victory was inevitable, that Soviet resistance was futile. But they did not break. They adapted. They learned. They paid a terrible price in blood and metal, but they found ways to fight back, found ways to close the gap, found ways to turn German technical superiority into a trap that consumed German resources and German lives. The Tiger tank killed thousands of Soviet soldiers and destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks, but it could not kill the Soviet Union's will to fight, and in the end, that will was the only weapon that truly mattered. The great predator that had struck such fear into Soviet hearts in the winter of 1942 was by war's end a historical curiosity, a cautionary tale about the limits of quality in the face of overwhelming quantity, a monument to German engineering excellence and German strategic failure, burning in the mud of 100 battlefields as Soviet armor rolled past toward Berlin and the final victory that all the tigers in the world could not prevent.